It was a race that had few rules. Its competitors, fewer scruples. Some men would lie, cheat, and steal to win. Others would sacrifice their own lives and those of their companions. For what? To be the first to plant a flag on 2 empty stretches of ice. This is the story of the race for the North and South Poles. The end of the 19th century saw an era of fast-paced change. In man's quest to conquer the natural world, there remained few unexplored realms on Earth. Among them were 2 imaginary points surrounded by hundreds of miles of ice and snow, the North and South Poles.
It's an imaginary spot, but there was a spot to be reached. And once you reached it, then nobody else could reach it first.
These frozen realms summoned a select group of men, determined to test themselves against nature, seeking a chance at immortality. Their names resounded in the press like modern-day rock stars. Peary, Cook, Scott, Amundsen. In order to survive, they had to fight not only the elements, but their own inner demons. In order to win, they had to risk their very lives. April 1st, 1909. Commander Robert E. Peary and his support teams picked their way through shifting ice in his latest effort to reach the North Pole. Each night they dined on the same meal of pemmican, a concoction of dried meat, fat, and raisins. Each morning, they struck camp and labored 10 hours to cover 10 miles. Through all of this, the same fear tormented the famous explorer. Peary knew that at the age of 52, this was certainly his last chance to realize his quest. Time was not the only enemy. Peary's polar rival, Dr. Frederick Cook, had quietly sent word to his supporters that he would attempt to reach the North Pole first. Peary seethed. He hadn't expected a race for the pole. He believed it was his prize, and conquering it, his destiny.
Peary had no use for anybody who he saw as a rival, and they were all rivals if they were seeking the North Pole or anything like it.
Robert Edwin Peary took his first breath on May 6, 1856, in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. His father died when he was barely 3 years old, leaving the boy nicknamed Bertie in the care of his doting mother.
She had raised him in a very girlish fashion for the first 6 or 7 years of his life, and he would often come home with his clothing torn, having been in fights, because he'd had to assert himself in order to prove that he was really a little boy and not a little girl.
Like most boys of the time, Peary enjoyed reading stories of Arctic adventures and polar bear hunts. He finally saw the Arctic with his own eyes while visiting southern Greenland in 1886. It was here, while on leave from his job as a civil engineer with the U.S. Navy, that the 30-year-old lieutenant began to design his own destiny. Upon his return home, Peary penned a revealing letter to his mother.
My last trip has brought my name before the world. My next will give me a standing in the world. Remember, Mother, I must have fame, and I cannot reconcile myself to years of commonplace drudgery when I see an opportunity to gain it.
He gravitated towards the idea that the way he would earn fame is be remembered as the man who actually was the first to stand at the North Pole.
The North Pole. Since the dawn of civilization, it was a mystery that had intrigued all manner of men. Vikings were the first to venture into the forbidding north. But an impenetrable pack of ice pushed them back. Generation upon generation of adventurers followed in their wake, with little success. By 1882, the farthest north reached by man was still 400 miles shy of the pole. Now, Robert Peary dreamt of adding his name to the roster of Arctic heroes. Peary believed that if he wanted to reach the pole first, he would have to race against other contenders just as eager to claim the prize. His strategy was to search for a gateway to the pole through Greenland's uncharted northern territories.
Nobody was quite sure where the continent ended, you see. Nobody was quite sure that maybe the land reached all the way from the north end of North America, which nobody had seen, right to the North Pole.
As he laid the plans for this latest adventure, Peary was about to meet another American who would play a leading role in this polar contest. Dr. Frederick Cook.
Dr. Cook was a man unknown. People were very divided about who he was. His enemies said he was nothing but a cheap fake. And his friends said that he had never had a bad day in his life until he got mixed up with Robert E. Peary.
Frederick Albert Cook was never a stranger to adversity. By age 23, this resourceful son of German immigrants had worked his way through medical school by selling milk. That same year, he lost his wife and newborn baby due to complications from childbirth. The grieving doctor filled his days reading Arctic explorations by the famous American explorer Elisha Kent Kane.
He had a devouring ambition to go there. And he read an advertisement in a newspaper in New York that had been placed there by Peary asking for a surgeon for his first North Greenland expedition. Aha! This is what he wanted.
Cook and Peary met for the first time in Philadelphia in the spring of 1891. The doctor impressed Peary as the kind of man he sought for his mission.
Peary didn't really want any rivals on this expedition, so he looked for people who were enthusiasts but amateurs. He had an interview with Dr. Cook and accepted him that day to be the expedition's physician.
The stage was set. In the coming years, Cook and Peary's ambitions would clash in a bitter race for the North Pole. The North Pole. By the age of 30, Lieutenant Robert E. Peary had chosen this hostile realm of ice and snow as his sure road to fame and fortune. In July of 1891, the civil engineer obtained a 2-year leave from the Navy and headed north as leader of an exploratory expedition. As his ship Kite encountered sea ice, Peary was finally entering the Arctic of his boyhood dreams.
Great masses of ice were thrust to one side, causing the ice in the immediate vicinity to fairly boil. But the good old Kite just pushed them to one side, leaving them groaning and creaking in the distance.
After 4 weeks sailing, Peary and his 6-member team disembarked to a rocky shore in northern Greenland. The area was inhabited solely by native Inuit.
In those days was basically like going to the moon. The whale ships don't go any further than that, and when the winter comes particularly, the ice comes down the channels there and blocks anything from happening.
The expedition was already making headlines back home. Josephine, Peary's wife of 2 years, had accompanied him north, causing a newspaper sensation.
The press was divided between extolling her for being so brave and loyal to her husband and excoriating Peary for even suggesting taking her along to what they called the icy Sahara. That was no place for a woman, according to the 19th century.
Josephine shared a wood cabin measuring only 22 by 12 feet with the 6 male members of the expedition. This would be their living quarters for a year. Peary hired an Inuit family to reside nearby, to provide his men with a hands-on education in Arctic survival. Peary and Cook worked well together in the crisp chill of northern Greenland. Cook let his hair grow long and wore furs loosely in the Inuit fashion, which kept an insulating layer of warm air near the skin.
Dr. Cook just seemed so adept and so confident and so able to do so many things that he rose to sort of the unofficial second in command by the time the expedition was over.
Josephine also adapted fairly well, even joining the men for a walrus hunt. There were other local customs she found less palatable.
The women had a tendency, like the men, when the igloo got hot, to peel off, to strip down to their waist, and this Victorian woman didn't think much of that, although they invited her to a number of times.
In May of the following year, Peary set out northward over the ice cap. Here, his journey to the pole truly began.
When you're on that glacier, you can literally only see three things, and that is an infinite amount of ice, an infinite amount of sky, and sunshine. That's it. There's nothing else to be seen. I think he was fascinated by that.
Peary traveled 500 miles before dwindling supplies forced him to turn back. He had made no real inroads to the pole. Still, he did claim at least one important discovery. He charted a channel of water previously undiscovered. Peary speculated that it formed the northern boundary of Greenland.
Peary Channel, it was on the maps for some time till people got there and found there was no channel. He had either seen something or thought he saw something, or he had invented something. My feeling is that his ambition was such that, you see, he had to bring back something. For every trip he made, he had to bring back a triumph so that he could get money for the next trip.
Peary returned to the States and launched a lucrative lecture tour. As his fame grew, he began planning a second expedition that would head even farther north. At the same time, his colleague, Dr. Frederick Cook, requested permission to publish his own studies of the Inuit. Peary refused, preferring to keep the limelight focused on himself. Dr. Cook promptly resigned. The foundation of their polar rivalry was beginning to take shape. September 13th, 1893. Lieutenant Peary's second expedition started on a high note. A pregnant Josephine had once again accompanied her husband to Greenland. With the onset of the sunless winter, she gave birth to their first child, Marie Anagito Peary.
The Eskimos called her the snow baby because she was so white when she was born that she looked like snow, and they used to have to come and actually touch her to make sure that the flesh was warm.
Peary's joy at fatherhood couldn't compensate for the fact that he made no progress toward the pole. When he once again set out over the ice cap, bad weather destroyed vital food supplies. Peary now faced a polar explorer's most dangerous hazard: starvation. A herd of unlucky musk oxen saved the day. Despite these difficulties, the explorer artfully salvaged his reputation by transporting 2 huge meteorites to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Impressed by his resourcefulness, a group of wealthy Americans united to form the Peary Arctic Club. They pledged their considerable power and resources to make Peary the man who would plant the American flag at the North Pole. At the same time, across the Atlantic Ocean, a new competitor of Peary's was working to thwart their plans. The Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen had designed a unique ice ship, the Fram, and in 1893, he sailed her high into the Arctic ice pack. Nansen then set out on skis toward the pole, setting a record farthest north before turning back. Alarmed that his prize was in danger, Peary responded with a bold plan of his own.
He launched a grand plan in 1898, a 5-year expedition in which he said he was going to camp by the shores of the polar sea and lay siege to the pole, and he would try year after year for 5 years to reach the pole until he succeeded.
The words resonated with confidence, but even as he spoke them, Peary knew that the stakes were getting higher, his competitors more determined, and he himself almost recklessly desperate. After 2 failed attempts to reach the North Pole, Robert E. Peary's desire had become an obsession. Even the furnishings of his Washington, D.C. apartment reflected the powerful grip the Arctic held on his life. In the summer of 1898, he bid his pregnant wife and 4-year-old daughter goodbye and headed north once again, in his own words, to lay siege to the pole. There was a hitch in Peary's plan. A Norwegian expedition was also exploring the same part of the Arctic. Peary was certain they were intent on beating him to the pole. Gripped by paranoia, the lieutenant started for his northern headquarters during the dark winter, when temperatures were dangerously low.
It was a 150-mile trip. It took a number of days, and it was done partly, at least, in the dark of the moon, so that they literally could only go along the coast by feeling their way.
Even Peary's longtime assistant, Matthew Henson, struggled in the extreme cold. Peary had first hired Henson 12 years earlier as his manservant during surveying work in Nicaragua. Henson soon became the lieutenant's right-hand man.
Henson proved to be so reliable, so durable, and so dependable that Peary never again left the shores of the United States on expeditionary work without Henson as one of his companions.
After 17 days of sledging, the men arrived at a vacant hut that had been used by explorers in decades past. Once inside, Peary complained of a wooden feeling in his feet. Henson removed Peary's boots to discover that his toes were black. They were completely frozen. The condition was so severe, the expedition doctor amputated most of them within the week. Peary lay for 6 weeks unable to move, unsure if he would ever walk again. Still, he took a pencil and wrote on the wooden wall beside his bunk, "Inveniam vium at facium." I shall find a way or make one.
He never complained, never whimpered. He used to say, well, this is what you have to do to get to the North Pole. The fact that he lost his toes meant nothing to him as much as getting to the pole.
Peary remained in the Arctic for 4 years, but his injuries prevented any serious attempt on the pole. Undaunted, the commander retreated to his property on Eagle Island, Maine, to formulate his next plan of attack.
Peary had failed in 3 major expeditions to reach the pole. He felt that one of the reasons was because he started from not the shores of the Arctic Ocean where the ice was ready for him, but from 300 to 400 miles south of that point, which is as far as any ships could penetrate to get him there.
Like Nansen before him, Peary decided he would build a special ship that could take him directly to the shores of the Arctic Ocean. But he would be forced to bide his time during its construction, leaving the pole vulnerable to other contenders. By 1897, Peary's one-time colleague, Dr. Frederick Cook, had returned to his medical practice. Business was thriving. Still, he wanted desperately to return to polar exploration. One afternoon, a telegram arrived requesting his service as surgeon with a Belgian Antarctic expedition. 5 months later, Cook was on board the Belgica, exploring the ice-covered outer islands of the southern polar continent, Antarctica.
Seals have been stealing about the ship under the water. On the ice, we have seen a few king penguins, looking as solemn and dignified as deacons at a love feast. Deserlache says he will make another attempt to push southward tomorrow.
The expedition went so far south that when the winter closed in, they were unable to return because they were frozen in the ice. So the Belgica became the first expedition to winter in the Antarctic.
Cook welcomed the opportunity to closely examine this new landscape and made several sledge journeys across the virgin snow. He shared his sense of wonder with Belgica's second mate, a young Norwegian who would one day figure dramatically in the race for the Southern Pole. His name was Roald Amundsen.
Amundsen was a shy guy, a kind of a dreamer, a little boy who wanted to be a great man someday.
Since his boyhood, Amundsen had dreamed of following in the footsteps of famed explorer Fridtjof Nansen. Amundsen's internship aboard Belgica figured as part of that plan. He recognized early on that he had much to learn from Dr. Cook's experiences.
Amundsen knew the snow from Norway, but he didn't really knew the ice. Dr. Cook learned him a lot about that, and also the Eskimos. They discussed the clothes, the food, how to get warm, how to sleep, all these classical themes of the polar expeditions.
Spring arrived, but the ice near the ship remained frozen. Belgica's crew grew desperate. Cook convinced the men to take up picks and axes and dig a channel through the floe to a distant pool of water. 2 months later, a lead opened, allowing the ship to escape.
No body of men were ever happier than the officers and crew of the Belgica as the good old ship thumped the edges of the ice, which had held her a prisoner for nearly a year.
Cook had returned from Antarctica a bona fide explorer. His hunger for celebrity now rivaled that of his old friend Robert Peary, who was once again preparing to try for the pole. In March of 1905, Commander Peary christened his sturdy new ice ship Roosevelt in honor of the popular American president. His planned departure in July would be especially difficult for his wife Josephine. She knew that Peary had taken an Inuit mistress during his last expedition.
I believe she was 14 or 15, which sounds scandalously young, but she was a married woman, and all of the Eskimos were quite surprised that Peary took so long to develop a relationship.
Peary even took a series of provocative photographs of his young lover, Alikasina. In each, he has placed her on a pedestal, literally posing her as his Arctic Venus. Josephine was hurt and angry when she learned that Peary had sired a child with the woman he called Ali.
She had a choice. She could either leave him, I suppose, or she could send him back despite the dangers. And she knew he would not be happy until he tried, and so she allowed him to go back.
Captained by Newfoundlander Bob Bartlett, the Roosevelt successfully battled sea ice, carrying Peary to the edge of the Arctic Ocean by September 1906. By beginning his polar assault from here, Peary would eliminate hundreds of miles of needless travel over land. As the endless night of winter settled over the ship, Peary lived on board, enjoying many of the comforts of home. Outside, the ice shifted and groaned with the changing winds and tides. The following spring, the 49-year-old Peary prepared for what he considered to be his best opportunity to realize his dream.
He felt that his equipment was in right order. He was also employing the Eskimos as his drivers as well as his helpers, so he felt that he had all the expertise in the right place at the right time to do what he wanted to do.
This time we shall win. God and all good angels grant it, and let me seize this great trophy for the flag.
To succeed, Peary would have to travel over 800 miles while transporting literally tons of supplies. He would have to return before the ice pack began to thaw, which would cut him off from land. February 28, 1906. Matthew Henson led the way as sledge teams forged a trail through the maze of water and ice. They chopped through massive pressure ridges. They crossed open leads of water on a raft of pancake ice.
It was rough going. There were these great leads. One of them, which Peary called the River Styx, was a mile wide, and that forced him to detour around it, so that made it very difficult to get there.
Even their Inuit companions were uneasy. They rarely traveled so far from the safety of land. At one point, a powerful storm blew in, trapping the men in their igloos for 6 long days. Despite these setbacks, Peary reached within 180 miles of the pole, closer than any man before him. But it was late April, and the ice was breaking up around them. Peary and his men were forced to turn back.
He says in his diary that he tried to thank God for this margin of success, but the fact was he didn't reach the pole, and what he wanted to do was reach the pole.
With the coming of summer, a defeated Peary reluctantly sailed for home.
I have failed once more. I shall never have the chance to win again.
From his home in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Frederick Cook had been following Peary's exploits with veiled interest.
There are a lot of indications that Dr. Cook was interested very early in an attempt on the North Pole. But Dr. Cook was a very sagacious man, and he understood that he just couldn't go out and get the financing and the backing for an attempt on the North Pole without some prior accomplishments to give him credibility.
To establish himself as a serious contender, Cook set out for Mount McKinley, Alaska in 1906. His goal? To be the first man to scale the tallest peak in North America. That September, he headed for an eastern ridge with a packer named Edward Burrill. 12 days later, the two men returned, announcing that they had reached the summit.
This was quite a surprise to a lot of the other expedition members, but there was no real doubt raised that Dr. Cook was not telling the truth about this, although there were some Alaskans that didn't believe that anyone from what they called the outside, and they still do, could possibly have carried off such a feat so easily.
The National Geographic Society celebrated both Cook and Peary's accomplishments at their annual banquet in Washington, D.C. on December 15th, 1906.
They were apparently still speaking at that time. They still appeared to be on friendly terms. Now, whether Peary liked the accolade which was given Cook at that dinner by Alexander Graham Bell, no one will ever know.
In Dr. Cook, we have one of the few Americans who has explored both extremes of the world. And now he has been to the top of the world.
Perhaps these words provoked Peary's simmering jealousies. When he rose to speak, the commander announced that he hadn't yet abandoned his life's ambition.
To me, the final and complete solution of the polar mystery is the thing which should be done for the honor and credit of this country, the thing which it is intended that I should do, and the thing that I must do.
Was Cook sitting there in Peary's shadow, already planning his own attempt to win the pole for himself? July 9th, 1908, New York City. A crowd gathered along the shores of the East River as the ice ship Roosevelt pulled out of its berth. Robert E. Peary, America's most famous polar explorer, was leaving for one final attempt to reach the North Pole. Even President Roosevelt joined in the excitement. Peary stopped at the president's home on Oyster Bay.
Roosevelt came and inspected the whole ship. He admired Peary for heading off into the wilderness. He admired the grit, the determination. When he left, he turned to Peary. He said, "I believe in you, Peary, and I believe in your success if it is within the possibility of man."
Peary's success seemed a foregone conclusion, yet there was an undertone of desperation beneath the fanfare. Peary was 52 years old. If he faltered in this attempt, history would brand him a failure for all time. To make matters worse, an unexpected challenger had emerged to provoke him. This time, an old friend. A year earlier, in July of 1907, Dr. Frederick Cook had quietly sailed into Arctic Canada, simply, he claimed, to go on a hunting trip with a wealthy sportsman, John R. Bradley. A few months later, Bradley returned to the States alone. Cook had stayed behind, setting his sights on a surprising goal.
He wrote to the Explorers Club officially announcing his attempt at the pole. He said, "I find I have a good opportunity to go, so I've stayed." And he said, "So here's to the pole with the flag."
Cook knew of Peary's plans to try for the pole in 1908. Did the doctor purposely head north a year earlier to try to beat Peary at his own game?
Both Peary and Cook ardently desired to reach the North Pole, and each desired to reach it first. I believe he thought that Peary just simply was not going to make it.
Peary was furious. In his eyes, this was a betrayal. But measuring Cook's impulsive decision against his own careful preparations, he refused to view his rival as a serious threat. August 1908. The Roosevelt arrived at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. On board were 89 men, including 69 Inuits, and 246 howling dogs. By the end of February 1909, Peary once again prepared to set out across the drifting pack ice. They were 420 miles from the North Pole. Peary had created an innovative relay sledging system. A pioneer team led by Captain Bob Bartlett headed out first, breaking a trail through the jumble of pressure ridges that stacked up like an accordion against the shore. 2 hours later, another team followed, storing vital supplies along the way. Peary and his longtime assistant Matthew Henson were the last to break camp. They began moving easily along Bartlett's trail. 5 days later, a wide stretch of open water, Peary called the Big Lead, halted their progress. Precious days passed as they waited for it to freeze over. The stakes were high. Peary had risked his own money to finance this attempt.
He had an advance from the New York Times of $5,000 for the story of his reaching the pole. If he did not succeed in reaching the pole, he had to repay that $5,000, which was a tremendous amount of money in those days.
Peary had sacrificed more than money to his polar dream. He had abandoned his family for years at a time. Josephine never demanded that he stay home, but she wrote him of her pain.
"Oh, Bert. Bert, I want you so much. Life is slipping away so fast. Pretty soon it will be over.
Still, Peary's only focus was the clock ticking away his dream. After 6 long days, the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a rubbery layer of ice formed over the lead. The sledging teams finally continued northward, averaging 12 miles a day. One at a time, as they completed their jobs, the support parties began to turn back. On March 31st, Peary reached a record farthest north, 133 miles short of the pole. From here, Peary, his aide Matthew Henson, and 4 Inuit would make the final dash.
They rested a day, and then they took off and went as far and as hard as they could.
Conditions on the drifting ice were unusually stable. The sledge meter measured record-breaking speeds, averaging 26 miles per day.
Peary described them one time where the dogs were at a dead run on a newly frozen lead, and you can imagine this would be like running on an ice rink. It was just perfect for their purposes.
5 days later, Peary stopped to take a series of sightings. His calculations told him that he was roughly 3 nautical miles shy of 90 degrees latitude north. The North Pole was within reach, somewhere in the blur of white surrounding him. Yet with scarcely a word to Henson or the Inuits, Peary stumbled into his igloo and went to sleep.
It seems like he would have been jumping up and down for joy. But he said nothing about it, and he kept his counsel for quite a long time.
When he woke 4 hours later, Peary took a series of short sledge journeys up to 10 miles beyond his camp. Even allowing for slight navigational errors, this ensured that he had crossed over the pole. The date was April 6th, 1909. Robert E. Peary had worked toward this moment all his life. Yet, his emotions were oddly restrained.
At this place, which my observations indicate to be the north polar axis of the Earth, I leave this record and the flag in possession, Robert E. Peary.
After only 30 hours at the pole, the sledges retreated back over the ice, once again at remarkable speeds. Any evidence of their polar camp would soon drift away with the tide. When the men arrived back at the Roosevelt, they were so tired they could hardly smile. Peary's strange behavior continued as he secluded himself in his cabin aboard ship for the return voyage. 4 months passed before the Roosevelt arrived at a settlement with a telegraph station. Peary announced his victory to the world, saying, "Stars and stripes nailed to the North Pole." In reply, he received chilling news. 5 days earlier, Dr. Frederick Cook had emerged from the Arctic, claiming he had reached the pole first.
Peary was flabbergasted and bitterly angry, and he probably never got over that particular shock.
Peary had lost. The world was indeed celebrating a polar hero, but it was Cook's story that they eagerly followed, as it unfolded on the pages of the New York Herald. March 18th, 1908. Robert E. Peary was still in New York, outfitting his ship, when Cook had set out from the tip of Axel Heiberg Island. He had the support of only 2 Inuit hunters. 520 miles of ice lay between him and the pole.
Cook's Great Sledge Journey is one of the great journeys in history. It took him 34 days travel by sledge over mountainous pressure ridges, hummocks, open leads of water. Frederick Albert Cook reached the North Pole on April 21st, 1908. He realized the ambition of his life and became thereby the discoverer of the North Pole.
Finally, under skies of crystal blue, we touch the mark. We are at the top of the world. The flag is flung to the frigid breezes of the North Pole.
Cook had reached the pole almost a full year before Commander Peary. But his good fortune didn't hold. The ice began to break up during his return trek, separating the party from vital supply caches. He and his 2 Inuit companions were forced to winter on an island in the high Arctic.
He claimed he lived like Stone Age hunters in that winter. They had no ammunition, no civilized food of any sort, and that he had turned all his dogs loose, and therefore he had no dogs to aid him in the hunt or in transportation.
The following spring, the 3 men headed out again. They journeyed over 1,000 miles, finally reaching a Danish settlement in Greenland.
They were almost in a state of starvation, exhausted beyond description, remnants of human beings. But the spirit was there. Frederick Albert Cook did it, and he brought them through with him.
Cook had been in the Arctic for over 18 months. Now, as he announced his victory to the world, the real competition between Peary and Cook was only just beginning. August 1909, Uummannaq, Greenland. Frederick A. Cook was eager to tell the world of his polar conquest. He boarded the first ship leaving Greenland, which carried him to Denmark. Cook had already wired the New York Herald, announcing that he had reached the North Pole on April 21st, 1908. When the doctor arrived in Copenhagen, he was received as a hero.
Dr. Cook was an overnight sensation. He might call him sort of the Lindbergh of his time. He was given the gold medal of the Danish Geographical Society, and he was literally showered with accolades and acclaim.
At a banquet given in his honor, Cook first received word of Robert Peary's claim to the pole.
He kept a very gentlemanly approach. He said, "There's honor enough for both of us, so why should I object? 2 records are better than 1.
Commander Robert Peary shared no such magnanimous feelings. He never once entertained the notion that Cook had truly reached the pole. Logistically, he reasoned, no man could have gone that far out on the ice without more supplies and men to carry them. While in Nova Scotia, Peary fired off a telegram to the New York Times.
I am the only white man who has ever reached the pole. Do not trouble about Cook's story. He has simply handed the public a gold brick.
Since no flag would still stand in the drifting ice of the pole to settle the issue, Cook offered his personal records to the University of Copenhagen as proof. A newspaper war erupted as accusations flew between the 2 camps. The race for the North Pole became a race for the hearts and minds of the public. Once again, Peary was losing.
Peary fervently believed, absolutely believed, that Cook did not make it and that Cook was lying. But the American people believed initially that Cook had done it and that Peary was nothing except sour grapes, and they reacted very bitterly to Peary's claims that Cook was a liar and a cheat.
No parades with cheering crowds awaited Peary when he arrived in New York. He retreated to his home on Eagle Island, Maine, obsessed with proving Cook a fraud.
Peary was angry. His reaction was never anything but anger as far as Cook was concerned, and frankly, I don't blame the old guy.
The first major blow to Cook's credibility came from an unexpected source. Ed Burrill, Cook's packer on the Mount McKinley expedition, told Peary supporters that Cook had fabricated the story of his famous ascent.
Ed Barilla said that no, they hadn't actually climbed Mount McKinley at all, but they had climbed a very insignificant little peak, and that he had taken his by now famous summit photograph on the top of that peak with Ed Barilla standing there holding a flag on an ice axe.
Some people believe that members of the Peary Arctic Club bribed Barilla to change his story. Nonetheless, when asked by reporters to provide his original diary of the climb, Cook refused, saying, "I do not see that it is material."
It really did strike a big blow to Dr. Cook's credibility, and from then on things just got more and more downhill for him.
The University of Copenhagen fired the final volley. After examining papers Cook had submitted to substantiate his claim, a committee announced that nothing in the material proved he had ever been to the pole.
Unfortunately, by then Dr. Cook had vanished and no one could ask him directly.
Cook had taken refuge outside the country to ride out the storm. He soon fell from America's hero to America's disgrace. With each step of Cook's descent, Robert Peary's favor rose accordingly. Peary submitted his records to a three-man committee of the National Geographic Society. They announced that he had satisfied their standard of proof. Hampton's magazine paid the explorer a record $40,000 to print his story. Next, Peary pushed for promotion to Rear Admiral of the Navy so he could retire with full pay. Once again, he was asked to prove his claim, this time before the House Naval Affairs Committee.
In those days, explorers were believed. Everything they said was gospel. They stopped believing when Peary began to question Cook's credentials. And so people started looking into Cook, and then they started looking into Peary.
Peary delayed producing his original records, never offering all the documentation requested. Much like Cook before him, doubts about Peary's story began to surface in the press.
If you look at his entire pattern of behavior once he made his claim, he clearly seems to be a man trying to shield from the spotlight of impartial investigation his greatest deceit.
Although one congressman dubbed him a fake pure and simple, Congress passed a bill honoring Peary for his historic achievement and retired him at the rank of Rear Admiral. His place in history seemed secure, although because of his dispute with Dr. Cook, Peary was never satisfied that he had achieved the level of fame he deserved. He died February 20th, 1920, at the age of 63, and was buried with full military honors in Arlington Cemetery. The inscription, "Discoverer of North Pole," marks his grave.
I can't imagine his ever saying that the sacrifice wasn't worth it. He did something because it was there, and he showed grit and determination, creativity, durability. He was your classic American hero, and with the possible exception of Lewis and Clark, he was America's greatest explorer.
Dr. Frederick Cook resurfaced a year after his disappearance, explaining that he had been suffering from mental fatigue. Cook went on to defend himself in print and anywhere else he could tell his story, even on the vaudeville circuit. In 1923, a Texas jury found him guilty of defrauding stockholders in a failed oil land deal. Paroled in 1930, the discredited explorer passed the ensuing years attempting to restore his name. 2 years before his death in 1940, Cook recorded this last radio interview for posterity.
I have been humiliated and seriously hurt, but that doesn't matter anymore. I'm getting old, and what does matter to me is that I want you to believe that I told the truth. I state emphatically that I, Frederick A. Cook, discovered the North Pole.
Was Peary indeed the first man to achieve that honor? Did the prize belong to Cook? Or should both explorers' claims be questioned? Some modern experts believe that Peary, faced with personal failure, falsified the facts of his final 5-day dash for fame and glory. They point to his sledging speeds over that period as improbable. They point to his moodiness upon his return as the product of a man preparing to perpetuate a fraud. More importantly, they offer hard evidence, 2 telling pages of his polar journal.
There's 2 days that he was allegedly at the North Pole. But there isn't anything in his diary about this. There are 2 blank pages. In his diary, there's a loose leaf page, separate, on different paper, on which Peary has put a date on it, written, "The Pole at last. I've found it," and so on. Very suspicious.
Peary's supporters, including the National Geographic Society, counter that modern photogrammetric tests measuring the angle of the sun in Peary's polar photographs prove he was no liar. Also, Peary took a series of ocean soundings that correspond to modern topographical maps, lending even more credibility to his claim. So many historians have challenged Peary's claim that modern dictionaries and encyclopedias now note the famous explorer as being usually credited with discovering the North Pole. Cook, on the other hand, is widely accepted as a fraud, although many supporters still defend his story.
I think today the evidence in the North Pole matter confirms Cook's discovery of the North Pole in April 1908. I believe it is overwhelming and it is massive.
Frederick Cook was a very likable man, affable, genial, pleasant. We've all met people like that in our times, and some of them are con men. Cook was a charlatan. There's absolutely no doubt he didn't get within a country mile of the North Pole. He faked the photographs, he faked everything.
He had a very odd outlook on immortality. He said, speaking of himself in the third person, there'll be a place for Dr. Cook in history. It might be high, it might be low, but there will be a place. And the fact that we're sitting here talking about Dr. Cook, I'm sure would please him immensely because he has gotten what he wanted.
In this climate of accusation and recrimination, no clear winner emerged from the race to the North Pole. But something was clearly lost in the struggle: America's trust in its heroes. The Peary-Cook rivalry laid bare that dark side of ambition which had driven promising men to lie, to risk lives, and ultimately to destroy each other, all in the name of glory. Yet other enterprising men were not discouraged from new contests. At the opposite end of the earth, on the frozen crust of a sleeping continent, 2 men, Norwegian Roald Amundsen and Englishman Robert Scott, prepared for a similar quest. Their target? The last great geographical prize, the South Pole. To reach it, they faced a harrowing journey. Only one of them would make it back alive. Naval service had long been tradition in the Scott family. When Robert Falcon Scott was born on June 6, 1868, his career as a seaman was preordained. By age 30, he had risen to the rank of torpedo lieutenant, but Scott had no money or family connections to ensure further advancement.
Scott felt himself to be intrinsically quite unlucky, that he had to overcome some obstacles which were always being put in his path. And it was this sense of struggle, I think, which sort of preyed on his mind at times.
Scott's moodiness may have also damaged his chances for promotion. One expert believes his naval records have been censored, concealing negative evaluations of Scott's on-the-job performance.
I'm morally certain that the Navy regarded him as a dud. There is evidence that Scott was regarded as mentally unstable by the Navy, and therefore, under normal conditions, would never have been allowed anywhere near the command of a ship of the line.
Scott's future seemed bleak until in June of 1899, he heard that the Royal Geographical Society was organizing an Antarctic expedition. He knew its president, Sir Clements Markham, was hoping to put a British naval officer at the helm, and Scott personally applied for the job.
He thought this was an opportunity which had been cast in his way. He really believed tremendously in fate. He had never, prior to this, thought of being an explorer or trying to get to the South Pole. In his own words, he said, "I had no predilection for polar exploration."
Gossips noted that Clements Markham seemed to prefer the company of handsome young men to women. Scott's brooding good looks and deep blue eyes, not to mention his charm, certainly caught Markham's attention. On August 6, 1901, Robert Falcon Scott sailed from the Isle of Wight in command of the National Antarctic Expedition. The expedition ship Discovery had been built especially for polar travel. Most of the crew on board were Navy men like Scott, with no mountaineering or other suitable training for the ordeal that lay ahead. Their selection reflected the bruised state of the British Empire.
Queen Victoria died in 1901 after a very long, successful reign, and the British were finding themselves embroiled in a very difficult war in South Africa against the Boers. And there was this sense that somehow the British were losing their place in the world, that there was a softness creeping in.
To Clements Markham, Scott and his men represented the epitome of British manhood. Navy men who would battle the Antarctic and prove that the Empire could still win the day. January 3rd, 1902. 5 months after leaving England, Lieutenant Robert Scott and his ship Discovery crossed the Antarctic Circle. Perhaps it was here, dwarfed by these massive icebergs, that Scott began to envision a greater glory for England and for himself, to be the first to plant a flag at the South Pole. The Southern Pole had long played a secondary role to the north. Sealers and whalers visited Antarctica's outer islands to conduct their bloody hunts, while ice and fierce storms protected its inner shores. Man had yet visited only a few coastal areas of the mainland when Scott's Discovery docked on the edge of the Great Ice Barrier, a vast shelf of ice the size of Texas that permanently covers part of the Ross Sea.
The sun shines with extraordinary hard white glitter. There is nothing soft in the landscape at all. It dazzles you, it takes you out of yourself. It produces the wish to measure yourself against all that emptiness, all that delectable snow. It seduces you, and it is completely indifferent.
The men explored glaciers, where ice crackled like gunfire, and snow concealed gaping crevices. Their wonder turned to horror when one crewman slipped on a steep slope and fell to his death into the ocean below. In late April, the sun sank below the horizon for its winter hibernation. For 3 months, the men huddled in their quarters as storms raged outside. When night gave way to the midnight sun, Scott prepared to set out on an exploratory sledge journey inland. He selected 2 men to accompany him. The first was Edward Wilson, an amiable doctor and artist, whom the men had dubbed Uncle Bill. The second was Ernest Shackletone, an engaging Anglo-Irishman with polar ambitions of his own. On November 2nd, 1902, the 3 men saluted king and country with a champagne toast before the sledges pulled away. Scott's goal was to reach a record farthest south, possibly the South Pole itself. At first, the sledges virtually flew forward, but it wasn't long before the dogs became ill. The men used whips to spur them on. Still, their pace slackened.
They found the dogs very difficult to handle. Scott in particular had a true, I suppose you describe it as Englishman sentimentality about animals. The thought of having to use cruelty to make them work was something which was deeply stressful to him.
Scott lightened their loads, but this meant that the three men had to continually backtrack over their previous route in order to carry all their supplies forward. Their rations of seal meat, biscuits, and pemmican were inadequate for such taxing labor. December 30th, 1902. Scott and his men reached within 400 miles of the pole, a new farthest south, before turning for home. A few days later, the last dog died. The exhausted men attached themselves to the harnesses and began to man-haul their supplies. Shackletone's condition was by far the worst, leaving him unable to help pull the sledge. This incident would sever the bond between Scott and his Irish colleague and reveal a ruthless side of the explorer's ambition.
Scott saw this as a kind of moral collapse. He was very resentful that they had to carry the weight of Shackleton on the sledge, and he never really forgave him for it. In return, Shackleton never forgave Scott for the cold glances that he poured on him during that time.
The exhausted team arrived safely back at Discovery. Scott spent another year exploring, then filled with sadness, finally sailed from the Antarctic shores.
He truly fell in love with it. It captured something in his soul. It appealed to that dreaming, creative side of him that somehow couldn't be satisfied by his career in the Navy.
Robert Falcon Scott's first trek out on the ice would define the man's future. He would shape his approach to all Antarctic travel from this first failure with sled dogs. A decision that would one day put his life and the lives of his men at the mercy of the elements. That same year, the man who would one day be Scott's competitor, Roald Amundsen, was following his own compass toward the pole.
I think the most important things for Amundsen wasn't to discover the world, but that the world should discover him.
The tiny country of Norway was nearing a crossroad when Roald Amundsen was born on July 16, 1872. After 400 years of foreign rule, the last 60 under Swedish dominion, this nation of 2 million people was struggling for its independence.
Norway needed heroes at this point, very much. We didn't have very much self-confidence. And of course, we had one specialty, and that was coldness, snow, ice.
Like Peary and Cook, Roald had grown up admiring the early Arctic explorers and hoped to follow in their footsteps one day.
Now, Amundsen prepared himself very, very thoroughly. He had started as a youth to make himself a good skier and make himself awfully fit. He was in many ways a fitness freak.
Amundsen's first test came as second mate aboard Belgica when that ship was locked in the ice off the coast of Antarctica in 1898. There, the 26-year-old Amundsen had befriended Dr. Frederick Cook. Scurvy plagued the health of the crew during that long, sunless winter. After one man died, his body consigned to the water below the ship, his mates swore they could hear his ghostly cries.
Dr. Cook calls it a madhouse. Amundsen's reaction was very, very interesting. In the midst of these horrors, he stood back and was able to look at his shipmates and himself with clinical distance and analyze what was going on.
Amundsen was one of the first to follow Dr. Cook's advice and eat an unappetizing but healing portion of raw seal meat. To the stoic Norwegian, each obstacle was a test of his fortitude and adaptability.
The sun begins its return, but I have not missed it for one moment. On the contrary, I regret nothing and hope I have the health and strength to continue the work I have now begun.
Amundsen returned home, eager to build on his experiences and command an expedition of his own. His adventurous spirit next carried him into northern waters, where he endeavored to become the first man to navigate the Northwest Passage through Arctic Canada. He chartered a small sloop, the Ewa, and supplied her for Arctic travel. But Amundsen had a superstitious nature and chose to play down the objective of the expedition.
He stole away at the witching hour because he didn't want a send-off. He was in financial difficulties and afraid of his creditors. But it was not only that. He was afraid that having a great send-off would tempt fate and therefore put a curse on the expedition.
Amundsen's first expedition proved a brilliant success. Over the course of 2 years, he successfully navigated the Northwest Passage. Meanwhile, Amundsen continued his education in polar survival by studying the local Inuit. He also perfected a technique of cross-country skiing alongside sledges. The pace of the skier and the dogs seemed naturally synchronized, which increased his traveling speeds. When the Ewa re-emerged north of Alaska, Norway had gained her independence and welcomed him home as a favored son.
He didn't care for the plaudits. He wanted the approval of his peers, but he didn't care about the crowd. You see, he was an artist. And what he felt was, the Northwest Passage, it is my painting, what the Night Watchman would have been to Rembrandt.
Now, as the explorer retreated to his home on the waters of the Bunafjord, he set his sights on his next target. Once again, he wasn't looking south. It was 1905, and like Peary and Cook, Amundsen had his eye on the still undiscovered North Pole. Robert Falcon Scott rode a wave of celebrity upon his return from Antarctica, and his success won him a promotion to captain. After a few years of quiet naval service, Scott began to plan his return to Antarctica, only to learn that his estranged colleague, Ernest Shackletone, whose weakness he had openly disdained, was launching an expedition of his own.
I am astonished. Shackleton owes everything to me. First and last, I did much for him.
His first reaction was one of extreme anger. And I think what really got to him was the fact that Shackleton intended to return to the same area and wished to use the same facilities to stake a claim on what he clearly perceived to be his territory.
Like Peary before him, Scott felt a jealous proprietorship over the polar landscape he had once commanded.
Scott behaved as if he'd been betrayed, as if his property had been stolen, as if his moral rights had been impinged on.
Shackleton sailed for Antarctica in July of 1907, and against Scott's protests, established his base at McMurdo Sound. Relying on Siberian ponies instead of dogs, Shackleton explored a route up the Beardmore Glacier that cut through the mountains. He continued until he was within 97 miles of the South Pole. There, Shackleton made a difficult decision.
He turned for home because he'd calculated that the food just wouldn't stretch that far. He hated it, but he'd done the sums, he knew the truth, so he turned back.
When Shackleton's wife asked him how he had the courage to turn back so close to the goal. He said, he said, I thought you'd rather have a live donkey than a dead lion.
While Shackleton was setting records in Antarctica, Robert Scott was having difficulty funding another expedition to the South Pole. Then on September 2nd, 1909, newspapers around the world reported Dr. Frederick Cook's attainment of the North Pole. Within days, Robert Peary's counterclaim made headlines. This American victory reignited the flames of British nationalism. That same week, Scott finally announced the formation of his next Antarctic expedition. His goal was to reach the South Pole and secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement. In the months that followed, Scott chartered the small but sturdy Terra Nova. Once again, he staffed the expedition team with amateurs. Remembering the painful experiences of his first Antarctic trek, Scott decided to limit his reliance on sledge dogs. Instead, he ordered 3 highly experimental motorized sledges, and following Shackleton's lead, a stable of Siberian ponies. When Commander Robert Peary heard of Scott's unorthodox strategy, he warned the British commander against it.
I was with Scott for 2 weeks before his expedition started, and I talked dogs and dogs with him, but without results.
Scott stubbornly clung to his plans. After all, ponies had helped his rival Shackleton reach within 100 miles of the pole. Thousands of well-wishers cheered the Terra Nova as she departed Cardiff in mid-June of 1909.
We may get through. We may be wiped out. It is all a question that lies with providence and luck.
Scott realized that if he failed to reach the pole, Shackleton was waiting for another opportunity to steal the prize. What the commander of the Terra Nova didn't know was that a new competitor, Roald Amundsen, had secretly entered the contest. He was destined to make his name in Antarctica, but Roald Amundsen had originally set his sights on the northern pole. In the years following his navigation of the Northwest Passage, he had begun to work towards attaining this prize. He obtained Fridtjof Nansen's permission to use the famous ice ship Fram, which had carried Nansen to glory during his attempt to the North Pole in 1895. Amundsen hoped she would do the same for him. He was already supplying the ship when the news of Cook and Peary's claims to the North Pole reached Norway.
That must have been a shock, a great shock to Amundsen. And he thought, what shall I do? But in one night or two, he saw clearly that he only had one choice left.
Nothing else remained for me than to try to solve that last great question, the South Pole.
Amundsen quietly reorganized his supplies and equipment for an assault on his new southern target. Except for a few close associates, he told no one of his intentions, not even his crew. Amundsen knew that Nansen had dreams of capturing the South Pole himself and would never support his change of plans. Then, only days later, Robert Scott publicly announced the formation of the British expedition.
Amundsen realized then the fat was in the fire, because his own government would stop him, because nobody wanted to antagonize Britain, which then was one of the great powers and one of the protectors, one of Norway's protectors.
As was his custom, Amundsen set sail from the Norwegian capital at midnight. He waited until the Fram reached Madeira off the west coast of Africa before informing his crew of their true destination.
There was a very, very dramatic scene when he told them that he'd bamboozled them. And by sheer force of character. A bit like Ulysses, one could imagine. He made them agree to go with him, most of them against their will.
From Madeira, Amundsen sent a letter to Nansen explaining his plans in full. As a courtesy, a telegram was also sent to Robert Scott. Roald Amundsen had pulled off his bold deception, but not without a price.
He had fooled the world, the nation, the king, Fridtjof Nansen. He couldn't come back without having been the first man on the pole. That was a question about life or death for Amundsen.
Meanwhile, in Melbourne, Australia, Robert Scott had stopped ashore to spend an evening alone with his wife. There, the captain found Amundsen's telegram waiting for him.
Beg leave to inform you, from proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen.
He was shocked. He certainly hadn't expected it. What this was actually now about was a race. And there was all the expectation back in Britain that if there was going to be a race, well, Scott must be the one to win it.
Now, as Scott's overloaded Terra Nova slowly continued southward, it seemed that his brief run of good fortune was running out.
If Amundsen wants to try for the South Pole, I can only wish him luck.
In the weeks that followed, Terra Nova suffered through fierce gales that threatened to sink the ship. The men were grateful to be back on solid ground when the ship dropped anchor near the old base at McMurdo Sound. But their luck hadn't improved. As the men unloaded one of the motorized sledges, it fell, crashing through the ice into the ocean below. A month later, during an exploratory excursion, Terra Nova crew members were surprised to sight the Fram in the Bay of Whales. From that position, Amundsen was 60 miles closer to the pole. Scott was furious when he heard the news, but vowed to go on without fear or panic. Both expeditions used the summer months to stockpile supplies along their polar routes. However, Amundsen stashed 10 times more per person than Scott, greatly increasing any margin for error. With the onset of winter, Scott and Amundsen could only wait for the sun to return so that the race could finally begin. On his part, the Englishman knew that his Norwegian rival's experience with dogs might lend Amundsen an advantage. As for Roald Amundsen himself, he began to worry that Scott's motorized sledges might provide a real threat to his own well-laid plans.
Amundsen was plagued all that winter by the fear of Scott. He could almost hear those motor sledges puffing away. And so he decided that he was going to set off for the pole ridiculously early in the season.
Temperatures hovered near minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit as the party of 8 men and 86 dogs set out for the pole on September 8th, 1911.
The going was glorious. Rarely have I known the going so good.
In the days that followed, the thermometer dropped to minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the sledge dogs were suffering. Amundsen faced a difficult decision. Would he go forward in these hellish conditions, or turn back, risking the prize?
If we are to win this game, the pieces must be moved carefully. One false move and everything can be lost.
After 6 days, they made a mad dash back to the safety of their base, where one of the men, Hjalmar Johansen, assailed his commander's poor decision-making.
I don't call it an expedition. It's a panic.
Amundsen responded by removing him from the polar party. 150 miles to the east, Robert Scott and his men prepared for their own dash for the pole. October 24th, 1910. Advance teams of the English polar expedition headed out to stockpile additional supplies. Robert Scott's main party followed on the 1st of November. The transportation logistics of Scott's plan soon began to fall apart.
The motorized sledges broke down very quickly. Unfortunately, they hadn't yet got engines which were reliable at low temperatures. There was a dog team zipping around, moving embarrassingly fast and really demonstrating that they should all be traveling with dog teams.
In contrast, Scott's Siberian ponies proved ill-suited to the climate as they struggled in the heavy snow.
It was a very bad plan to bring them in the first place. Their coats were much too thin for the temperatures. They quickly became emaciated and they died, and Scott felt as if he was drowning kittens daily.
December 9. We have camped, and the ponies have been shot. Poor beasts. They have done wonderfully well considering the terrible circumstances.
Even after the loss of the motorized sledges and the ponies, Scott sent the dog teams back to the base camp as he had originally planned.
He was never convinced that dogs could be pushed up a glacier or could be used to take him across the polar plateau to the pole. Scott and his men who went forward were reliant purely on their own efforts, man-hauling sledges that weighed 700 pounds apiece.
The men began to climb through the ice falls of the Beardmore Glacier, following the route that Ernest Shackleton had pioneered in 1908. At the end of each day, Scott measured their distances against his former colleague's pace.
In a way, Shackleton was a more real opponent for him than Amundsen, who was there at the same time, who was actually racing him. It was the ghost of Shackleton who led Scott on.
The Beardmore Glacier opened upon the vast windswept polar plateau. Reaching 10,000 feet above sea level, it is the coldest place on Earth. Temperatures can drop to minus 126 degrees Fahrenheit. With only 150 miles to the pole, Scott selected the men who would fill out his final four-man team.
There was Edward Wilson, the gentle naturalist and doctor and very gifted artist who'd been with him on the Discovery expedition. He also chose Edgar Evans, this very tall, robust Welshman. Captain Oates, in a sense, you could say, was an outsider. He didn't come from a naval background. He came from the army.
To everyone's surprise, Scott named a fifth man, Bertie Bowers, to the team.
That's 5 people in a 4-man tent, 5 people with 4 men's rations.
As the 5 men of the polar party began their final push, temperatures ranged from a balmy daytime measurement of 26 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 10 degrees at night.
The explorers were wet through almost all the time. They were wearing canvas outfits, unlike the furs that Amundsen was using, and it didn't wick sweat away from their skins at all. So their outfits froze solid during the nights, and when they put them on in the morning, they would melt on their skins, so they were constantly damp.
This afternoon we got about 10 minutes of snow, which was like breaking through a glass house at each step. Most of us are using goggles with glass of light green tint. We find this color very grateful to the eyes.
With each man harnessed to the sledge, they averaged from 5 to 13 miles a day. They were expending more calories than they were taking in. Slowly, hour by hour, their strength began to ebb. By the time Scott passed Ernest Shackleton's farthest south, the men were showing signs of scurvy. In similar circumstances, the wary Shackleton had turned back.
Scott went on because he was always inclined to believe that you could nudge the calculations by putting a bit more effort in. He thought that spiritual resources would get you through if there weren't enough biscuits. It was a terrible seduction.
Step by step, pulling their heavy load, the 5 men marched on over the hypnotic landscape. As they neared the South Pole, their weary spirits lifted.
It was Birdie Bowers who spotted what looked like a small black speck on the horizon, and he thought first of all that it was some sort of natural formation. But of course, as they got closer, the horrible truth became inescapable. What they'd actually been looking at was a flag, which had been left as a marker by Amundsen and his Norwegian party.
The date was January 16th, 1911. Scott and his men had traveled over 800 miles in 78 days, only to discover that Amundsen had already captured their prize. For Scott, it was pain almost beyond reason.
We have had a horrible day. Great God. This is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Scott and his men could only guess at the events which had brought the Norwegians to victory. October 20th, 1911. The great ice barrier, Antarctica. Determined to beat Robert Scott to the pole, Roald Amundsen struck out for the second time. Amundsen didn't know that he was leaving 11 days before the Englishman, giving him an advantage from the start. Even with dogs pulling the sledges, going was slow due to high winds and heavy snows. Unlike Scott, walking in the boot prints of his former colleague Ernest Shackletone, Amundsen was forging a new route through unexplored terrain.
Everything was a mystery. So that meant, for the last nearly 500 miles, he was a combination of an Olympic ski racer and an explorer in completely unknown territory.
After threading his way through the ice falls of the Axel Heiberg Glacier, Amundsen reached the Antarctic Plateau. Here, at the place he dubbed the butcher shop, the weakest dogs were killed and fed to the hungry survivors. From there, Amundsen's trek proceeded with an almost arrogant efficiency. With his combined use of cross-country skis and sledge dogs, his teams averaged 15 miles a day. A brilliant sun blazed overhead when the navigators signaled them to stop. 360 degrees of unbroken whiteness declared the truth. They were the first men to reach the South Pole. The date was December 15th, 1911. Scott and his men wouldn't arrive here for another 35 days. Amundsen asked each of his 4 teammates to place a hand on the staff as he drove the Norwegian flag into the ice.
It was the only way I could show my companions my gratitude here at this desolate and forlorn place.
Amundsen's men were in such good spirits that they gleefully raced each other as they headed back across the Arctic plateau. By January 30th, they were on board the Fram, steaming through the ice toward civilization and glory. Word of Amundsen's victory hit newsstands all over the world. In Norway, he was exalted in the press, although some were uneasy with this triumph at the expense of their British friends.
It was felt that he had been dishonest. This hurt him, I think, at one level, but at another level, he didn't care. The main thing, he had attained what he'd set out to in the manner in which he had proposed.
When Amundsen began his first lecture tour in Australia and New Zealand, no one had yet heard from Robert Scott or the Terra Nova. January 16th, 1911. After a difficult journey to reach the South Pole, Captain Robert Scott and his 4 companions planted the British flag 35 days after Roald Amundsen had claimed the prize for Norway. The Englishmen had no energy to hide their disappointment.
If you look at the photograph which they took of themselves at the pole, these 5 weary men who'd struggled so far, and been through so much, you can see the defeat in their faces, their expression. There's no light, there's no joy.
Their spirits broken, they now faced a return trek of over 800 miles. Their bodies, overtaxed and malnourished, were already breaking down. Scott's journal entry for that day spells out the blunt reality.
Now for the run home and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it.
The quantity of effort that went into the return journey is almost beyond human description. They hadn't been indoors for months. They hadn't been comfortable for months. But they managed to gut it out. Their pace getting gradually slower and slower and slower. A terrible thing to do to a set of bodies.
The robust Welshman, Edgar Evans, succumbed first.
He just really dropped out of the party and they found him wandering, later lying in the snow. It was a terrible psychological blow. Edgar Evans had died and they had to turn their backs on him and go on without him.
The 4 remaining men inched down the Beardmore Glacier and reached the Great Ice Barrier. They still had hundreds of miles to travel, but food and fuel were running low. Frostbite was ravaging their hands and feet, making it difficult to walk. The right foot of Army Captain Titus Oates was so completely frozen that he cut a hole in a sleeping bag, preferring to leave it exposed to the elements rather than endure the pain of thawing. By Saturday, March 17th, he had lost all hope of surviving. Scott recorded his final moments.
He was a brave soul. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, "I'm just going outside and may be some time." We've not seen him since.
Robert Scott, Edwin Wilson, and Bertie Bowers managed to press ahead a few more miles before a blizzard trapped them in their tent. With no fuel and no food, they began writing farewell letters to loved ones back home. It was Scott who wrote the most and the longest.
He wrote funeral music in words for the expedition. He made it seem as if a huge, invisible, somber orchestra were playing them off the stage of history.
I think the last chance is gone. We've decided not to kill ourselves, but to fight to the last for that depot. For his sake, I do not regret this journey, which has shown that Englishmen can endure hardship. After all, we've given our lives for our country. We've actually made the longest journey on record.
He wrote and wrote and wrote endlessly. Every time he breathed on the pages of his notebook, a thin sheet of ice would develop there, which he'd have to scrape off again so that the pencil would work.
On March 29th, Captain Robert Falcon Scott managed one last entry in his journal.
Outside the swirl of the tent remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. Ah, Scott, for God's sake, look after our people.
Nine months passed before a search party from Terra Nova located a small mound covered with snow. It was Scott's tent. Inside lay the frozen bodies of their comrades. They had died less than 11 miles away from One Ton Depot, a life-saving cache of food.
For me, really one of the most compelling parts of the whole story is not that Scott and his men failed, but that they so very nearly succeeded.
The grief-stricken survivors collected the letters and journals, then collapsed the tent over the dead men's bodies. They erected a stone monument to mark the grave. Flags around the world were lowered to half-mast as news of the catastrophe spread. In England, thousands of mourners filled St. Paul's Cathedral for a memorial service. Money poured in for the family members of the deceased. With war looming in Europe, the images of Scott and his dead companions were held up as heroic examples of the consummate British male. Scott's final words had accomplished the writer's mission.
Those are words with an incredible power to spread. Virtually everybody on the planet who read the newspapers in 1913 knew what Oates's final words had been when he stepped out into the snow. They were global celebrities.
Roald Amundsen was lecturing in America when he received word of Scott's death.
It was a terrible shock to him. It was totally unexpected. He was never in Scott's shadow as long as Scott appeared to be alive. But when Scott died, it drove him to the edge of sanity.
Amundsen remained active in polar exploration. In 1926, he joined an Italian, Umberto Nobile, for another historic polar expedition.
He flew in an airship across the Arctic Ocean and past the North Pole, therefore becoming the first man indisputably to have passed the North Pole, and certainly the first man ever to have reached both poles of the Earth.
In May of 1928, when the Italian's airship crashed during another Arctic flight, Amundsen rushed to join the massive search effort. On June 18, 1928, he took off in a small plane and headed north out over the ice. The 55-year-old polar legend was never seen again.
It was a suitable end. In a way, it was like the old Viking chiefs who, when their time was come, would just go out on one of their ships. Amundsen, in my view, was the greatest polar explorer, bar none. He was an artist. He was an artist in action.
The untimely passing of Robert Scott and his men marked the end of an era. The North and South Poles were no longer mysteries. For the most part, the surface of the Earth was mapped.
I think that with Scott's death, something else died, which was the idea that nature was there to be conquered. We don't see it as a huge thing which might crush us, which we must nobly fight against. I think we see it linked to the rest of the planet much more now.
Today, men and women still struggle each year to reach the ends of the Earth. Only now there are satellites tracking their positions. In Antarctica, an isolated scientific station marks the spot where Amundsen first staked the Norwegian flag. The North Pole and the South, two geographic prizes to which men assigned the inestimable value of honor, of reputation, of human life. Were the prizes worth the price?
The search for the North Pole especially was an exercise in futility. What does it prove? What do you learn from finding the North Pole except that you had a hell of a long walk, you know? There's nothing there.
Perhaps we have lost our ability to appreciate achievement without decrying the motive behind the deed. No man moves without ambition. No great man excels without a dream. The struggle to reach the poles was the culmination of centuries of exploration. Peary, Cook, Amundsen, and Scott had gone where other men could only dream. The prospect of adventure and a desire for glory had driven them out into the cold. These two empty stretches of ice merely provided the stage for their immortal race into history.